Our life seemed perfect. I would often look around our home and feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air as the early morning sun filtered through the curtains. Our kitchen, with its polished granite countertops and gleaming stainless steel appliances, felt like the heart of our home, a place where we had shared countless laughs, meals, and quiet moments. For years, I believed our marriage was solid, built on love, trust, and mutual respect. I had devoted the last 15 years to her. Now, in my early 40s, I had a successful career in finance and felt secure in my own skin. Sure, my job was demanding, but I always made time for her. She was my world. Everything I did was for her, for us. Our friends often told us how lucky we were, how perfect we seemed as a couple. I believed them. I had no reason to doubt her or our relationship. Our social life was vibrant but not overwhelming. We hosted dinner parties, invited friends over for drinks, and occasionally attended charity events. Our circle was small but tight-knit, full of people who had watched our relationship blossom over the years. But recently, something had changed. She had been staying late at work more often, coming home tired and distracted. At first, I attributed it to her ambition. She'd always been driven. And that's one of the things I admired most about her. But there was a growing distance between us, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Tonight, I decided to surprise her with a special dinner, something we hadn't done in a long time. I set the table, poured her favorite wine, and lit candles that cast a warm, soft glow across the room. I wanted to remind her of what we had, of what we'd built together, and I wanted to close the gap between us. As I was finishing the last touches, her phone buzzed on the counter. She had left it unlocked, as she always did, trusting me completely. I glanced at the screen, not intending to snoop, but something caught my eye, a message from someone I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat. The words were explicit, undeniably intimate, and they weren't from me. My hands shook as I read the message again, trying to process what I was seeing. Everything around me seemed to freeze. The warmth of the room faded, replaced by a cold emptiness. My mind raced, struggling to make sense of this. It couldn't be real, but it was. The message was there, clear as day. She was planning to meet him tonight. In that moment, everything changed. The life I thought I knew crumbled before me. The woman I thought I loved had been hiding a secret so dark it made my stomach churn. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the messages on her phone, each one worse than the last, filthy, explicit, filled with a passion I thought was reserved for us. But there were multiple men. Each name, each message was a new wound, a new betrayal. The room blurred as the reality set in. The dinner I had prepared grew cold on the table, the candles flickered, casting long shadows. It felt surreal, like I was watching my life fall apart from outside my own body. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the walls seemed to close in on me. 15 years of marriage, and not once had I doubted her. I had trusted her completely. How could she do this to me, to us? Nausea washed over me as I realized the extent of her betrayal. She hadn't just cheated on me, she had built a separate life filled with lies and deception. The thought of her with them, doing the things she used to do with me, made me feel sick. But beyond the pain, there was a growing anger, white hot, burning through everything else. I wanted to scream, to smash something, to hurt her as deeply as she had hurt me. But I didn't. Instead, I forced myself to breathe, to think. I needed to confront her, but not now, not while I was consumed with rage. I had to be calm, controlled. I needed to know everything, how long this had been going on, who these men were, why she had done this. I picked up her phone again, my hands steadier now, and began taking screenshots of every message, every photo. Some of the photos were of her. Others were of them together. I saved everything, even though it made me feel sick to my stomach. She had met them at hotels, at their homes, some of them even here, in our house, in our bed. The thought made me want to vomit. But I pushed it down. I needed to know the truth, all of it, no matter how much it hurt. As I gathered the evidence, something shifted inside me. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting, but it was joined by something darker, a need for revenge. She had destroyed everything we had, everything I thought we were, and for that, she would pay. I heard the garage door open and my heart skipped a beat. She was home. Quickly, I put her phone back on the counter and grabbed a glass of water, trying to steady my hands. When she walked in, she looked tired, distracted, just like she had for the past few months, but now I knew why. "Hey," she said, her voice soft, almost guilty. "Sorry I'm late, work was crazy today." I forced a smile, pretending to be calm. "No problem, I made dinner." Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, regret. I couldn't tell. "You didn't have to do that. I'm really not that hungry." "That's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can eat later." She walked past me and I caught a faint whiff of cologne, one that wasn't mine. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face neutral. I needed more time, more information, but I wasn't ready to confront her yet. She disappeared into the bedroom, and I heard the shower turn on. A few minutes later, I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. What do I do now? Do I confront her tonight? Or do I wait? Do I let her explain? Or do I hit her with the evidence immediately? The shower stopped, and a few minutes later she reappeared, dressed in a bathrobe, her hair wet. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "You okay?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Yeah," I lied, "just tired." She nodded, but there was an awkward silence between us. It wasn't the first time lately, but now I knew why. She had been pulling away from me for months, and I had been too blind to see it. We went to bed in silence, the distance between us palpable. As she turned off the light, leaving us in darkness, she reached for me, her hand resting on my chest. Her touch was familiar, but now it felt foreign. I considered pulling away, but I didn't. I needed more time. As she snuggled closer, I lay there, staring into the darkness, my mind racing. I had to be patient, had to gather all the evidence before I confronted her. But when I did, I would destroy her, just as she had destroyed me. The next morning I woke up before her. She was still fast asleep, her arm draped lazily across my chest. I lay there for a moment watching her, feeling a strange mix of love and disgust. This was the woman I had built my life around, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone. And yet she had become a stranger to me, a stranger capable of betraying everything we stood for. Today would be different. I had a plan, and I was ready to execute it. I slipped out of bed quietly, making sure not to wake her. After making myself a quick coffee, I headed to the office I had converted into a study. My mind was laser-focused on one thing, gathering every last piece of evidence I needed to ensure her world crumbled just like mine had. The phone calls to work were easy. I told them I needed a personal day. Nothing too suspicious. After all, I'd built up enough goodwill over the years. And once that was done, I began going through her desk. It was a mess of bills, receipts, and random papers. Nothing substantial jumped out at me until I found a small, leather-bound notebook tucked away in the back of a drawer. My heart raced as I flipped it open. Inside were dates, times, and places, all neatly listed. Alongside the dates were initials, RSJW, and others I didn't immediately recognize. But I knew what this was. It was her cheat sheet, a diary of her betrayals. The dates lined up with nights when she had said she was working late or out with friends. This was the proof I needed. She had been meticulous, careful even, but not careful enough. I took photos of every page, my hands shaking as I documented her deceit. Each name, each location, each sordid detail was laid out before me, and the rage inside me grew. This wasn't just a fling or a moment of weakness. This was calculated. She had planned these meetings, scheduled them into our lives, all while lying to my face. Once I had the notebook photographed, I decided to dig deeper. There had to be more. I went to the closet and retrieved the small safe where we kept important documents. She didn't know that I had figured out the combination years ago. As I unlocked the safe, I found what I was looking for, another folder labeled private. Inside were printed emails far more explicit than the texts I had already seen. These weren't just dirty messages, they were detailed plans for meetups, weekends away, promises of a future. The emails were from one of her lovers, Richard S., the man whose initials appeared most frequently in her notebook. The same Richard S. who, according to these emails, was planning to leave his wife for her. My stomach turned as I read his words, professions of love, promises to buy them a home together. It was all too much. My hands trembled with fury as I thought about how she had strung me along, keeping me in the dark while she made plans for a new life with him. I couldn't just confront her now, not when I was this enraged. I had to wait to plan this perfectly. She wouldn't just walk away from this. None of them would. Later that day, I began digging into Richard S. I used every connection I had, every favor I was owed. It wasn't hard to find him. He was a well-known businessman in the city, his face often plastered across local media for charity events and business deals. He looked the part of the perfect husband, always smiling with his wife, Margaret, by his side. I tracked down his work address, his home, his phone number, and everything I needed to confront him. The other men took more time to find, but I managed. One was a lawyer, another a doctor, all successful, all married, all with lives and families of their own. The more I found, the more furious I became. How could they carry on with their lives, acting like upstanding citizens while they were destroying mine? By the time she got home that night, I had assembled a folder full of evidence, texts, emails, photos, addresses, even security footage of their meetings. I knew everything now. I knew who they were, where they lived, and what they had done. I was ready. When she walked in, she looked exhausted. She gave me a tired smile, but I couldn't return it. The disgust was too strong. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice casual as if every cousin. "Fine," I replied, forcing the word out. "How about yours?" "Long," she sighed, dropping her bag on the counter. "I'm going to take a shower." I watched her walk away, my mind racing. I should confront her now, throw out everything in her face, but I didn't. Not yet. I needed to make sure that when I did, there was no way she could escape the consequences. I needed to ensure that not just she, but her lovers too, would be completely and utterly ruined. Over the next few days, I tracked her every move. I had GPS on her car, her phone, even her laptop. I knew where she went, who she met, what she did. I stayed in the background, watching from a distance, documenting everything. I watched her leave to meet Richard at one of their usual spots, and I recorded every second of it. The videos, the photos. I was building a case, one they wouldn't be able to refute. I started to play small mind games too, little things to make her feel paranoid. I moved items around in the house just enough for her to notice. I changed her alarm settings, erased emails from her inbox. I wanted her to be on edge, constantly second-guessing herself. And it worked. She became jumpy, nervous. At home, she was constantly checking her phone, her emails. She was unraveling, and I loved every second of it. Then, I went after the men. I sent anonymous messages to their wives, just enough to plant the seeds of doubt. I left photos in their mailboxes, sent emails from fake accounts. I wanted them to feel the same fear, the same paranoia that had consumed me. I wanted them to know that someone was watching, that their perfect lives were about to come crashing down. It didn't take long for things to start falling apart. One night, I overheard her whispering on the phone to Richard, telling him that something was wrong, that she thought someone knew. He tried to calm her down, but I could hear the fear in his voice too. They were scared. And they should be. They had no idea what was coming. Finally, it all came crashing down. She broke. It was a Saturday night when everything finally unraveled. She had been pacing around the living room for hours, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Every few minutes she'd glance at it, as if waiting for anything that might reassure her. I watched her from the kitchen, sipping my drink, waiting for the inevitable. She was about to crack, and I was ready to push her over the edge. Finally, she stopped pacing and looked at me. Her eyes were wide, panic-stricken. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. I set my glass down slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "What's going on?" I asked, pretending to be concerned. She hesitated, biting her lip, as if trying to find the right words. I think someone's been in the house," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. I tilted my head, feigning surprise. "What do you mean?" "Things are moving around," she said, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Emails are disappearing from my inbox, my passwords aren't working, and I swear I hear noises at night. I think someone's watching me." I stood up, forcing my expression to remain neutral. "Will you think someone's following you?" I asked, taking a step toward her. She nodded, her face pale, her hands trembling. I took another step closer, looking her in the eye. "Do you think we should go to the police?" Her eyes widened in terror and she shook her head frantically. No police. I don't think it's that serious." I acted as if I was processing this, then nodded slowly. "If you're sure." She swallowed hard, clearly unsettled. She wasn't used to being this vulnerable. She was always the one in control, but now, for the first time, she was powerless, and it terrified her. "I'm sure," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll handle it." I nodded again, giving her a reassuring smile, but inside I was grinning. She was scared, really scared, and that's exactly what I wanted. The next morning I ramped up the pressure. I hacked into her email and sent messages to her lovers, making them think she was compromised, that someone was closing in on them. I wanted them all to feel the noose tightening around their necks. And it worked. That afternoon, Richards called her. I listened in on the conversation from another room, my heart pounding with satisfaction as I heard the fear in his voice. "We need to end this," he said, his voice tight with panic. "It's too dangerous. I can't risk it anymore." She was frantic, begging him not to leave her. "Richard, please, I need you. Don't do this. We'll figure it out." But he was resolute. "No, we won't. We're going to get caught. I can't afford to lose everything over this. I have a family, a reputation. I can't do this anymore." I smiled to myself as I listened to their world crumbling. She was losing him, and she knew it. The desperation in her voice was palpable, but it didn't matter. Richard had made up his mind. He was going to cut ties, save himself, and leave her in the mess she had created. That night she came to me, broken and defeated. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked like a shadow of the woman I once loved. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands wringing together in her lap, and after what felt like an eternity she spoke. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. But I didn't look at her. I just kept staring at the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, and I could hear the sobs building in her throat. "I've made some mistakes," she whispered. I turned to her, my face a mask of shock and confusion. "What are you talking about?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked at me, her eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. "I've been unfaithful," she said, her voice breaking. "I've been seeing someone else. I'm so sorry." I sat there, letting her words sink in, pretending to be the devastated husband. I let her believe that she was in control of this conversation, that she was the one deciding to come clean. But I had known everything for weeks. I had orchestrated this entire confession. I let her cry, let her beg for forgiveness, all the while knowing that I already had my revenge. "I'll do anything to fix this," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. "Please, just tell me what to do." I looked at her, my face blank, emotionless. "I don't know if this can be fixed," I said coldly. She sobbed harder, her body shaking with the weight of her guilt and fear. "Please, I'll do anything," she repeated, her voice breaking. I stood up, looking down at her as she crumbled before me. She was a wreck, her hair disheveled, her face wet with tears, her body trembling. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction knowing that I had broken her, that I had destroyed the woman who had destroyed me. "Anything?" I asked, my voice cold. She nodded frantically, desperate for any chance of redemption. "And then pack your things and get out." Her face crumpled, and she nodded, knowing she had no other choice. She had lost everything, and she knew it. As she packed her bags, I watched her, my mind already moving to the next phase of my plan. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The charity gala was the perfect place for the final act of my revenge. It was one of those glittering social affairs where everyone knew everyone, and reputations were everything. She had to attend. It was a part of her role in the social circle we inhabited, and I made sure she would be there. She walked into the room looking stunning, wearing the red dress I had bought her for our anniversary last year, the same dress she had worn for me when our life still seemed perfect. But now, all I felt was contempt. The auction had just begun when I made my move. The lights flickered briefly, and then the screen set up around the room turned black. People glanced around, confused, murmuring among themselves, and then the images appeared, photos of her and her lovers, grainy but clear enough to identify who she was and who she had been with. The room fell silent. The guests, who just moments before had been laughing and chatting, now sat in stunned disbelief. The photos cycled through, each one more damning than the last. She froze, her face going pale as the realization hit her. This was no technical glitch, this was deliberate, and she was at the center of it. Her eyes frantically searched the room, and when she spotted me, her expression turned to one of horror. I stepped forward, making my way through the crowd. People parted for me, their eyes wide with shock and judgment as they realized I was her husband. I reached her just as the final images faded from the screen. "Enjoying the show?" I asked, my voice loud enough for those around us to hear. She turned to me, her face a mixture of panic and shame. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I smiled coldly. "I think the better question is, what have you done?" The crowd around us whispered, their eyes fixed on her. She was trapped, cornered, and there was no escape. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not here, not like this." But I didn't care. I wanted everyone to see, to know. This was my moment, my revenge, and I wasn't going to let her slither out of it. "Too late for that," I said, my voice steady. "Everyone knows now. You're finished." She tried to speak, to plead, but I had already turned my back on her, walking away from the wreckage I had created. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a wave, but it didn't bring the satisfaction I had expected. I had won, hadn't I? I had destroyed her, so why did I feel so empty? As I stepped outside into the cold night air, the weight of what I'd done settled on me like a suffocating blanket. My heart was pounding, but not from the triumph I thought I would feel. Instead, it was the emptiness. The silence outside the gala was deafening compared to the chaos I had just left behind. My revenge had been executed flawlessly, yet something was missing, the sense of satisfaction of justice served. All I felt was a hollow ache. I reached my car and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring out into the empty parking lot. The sound of people laughing and talking still echoed faintly in the distance, but I knew I couldn't go back in there. Not now, not ever. Everything I had built, everything I had been, was gone, and in its place was this cold, calculating version of myself that I didn't recognize. I started the car and drove home in silence, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. Richard was still out there, probably seething with rage after what I had done to him and his reputation. His threats echoed in my mind, and a part of me wondered if I had pushed him too far. But it didn't matter. I wasn't afraid of Richard. I had taken him down, just like I had taken her down. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, empty, lifeless. It had always been our home, filled with love and warmth, or so I had believed. Now it was nothing more than a shell, just like me. I walked inside and poured myself a drink, staring at the bottle on the counter. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it didn't bring the relief I was hoping for. I thought back to the look on her face, the absolute terror in her eyes as the truth unfolded in front of all those people. I had destroyed her, humiliated her in a way she'd never recover from, and yet I still felt nothing but the gnawing emptiness inside. Maybe I was wrong to think revenge would heal the wounds. Maybe there was no healing to be found in destruction. I was about to pour another drink when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up, half expecting more fallout from tonight. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." The words stared back at me, a cold reminder that Richard wasn't finished. A sense of dread crawled over me, but I pushed it aside. Richard could threaten me all he wanted, but I wasn't backing down. I had taken control, and I wasn't about to let him take it away. But still, as I sat there in the dark, sipping my drink, the message lingered in my mind. What did he mean it wasn't over? What more could he do? I had exposed everything, his affair, his lies. He was finished. Or so I thought. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. I thought there would be more fallout, more chaos after the gala. But instead, everything went eerily still. The phone calls stopped. The messages from Richard disappeared. It was almost as if I had won. But deep down I knew better. Richard wasn't the type to go down without a fight. I kept my guard up, constantly checking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had people watching him, tracking his movements, but nothing out of the ordinary came up. He was laying low, hiding from the mess I had created, and yet, that nagging sense of unease refused to leave me. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat. "Meet me at the warehouse. You know the one. Let's settle this." It was from Richard. My pulse quickened as I read the message. The warehouse. He was calling me out. He wanted to end this on his terms. My hands tightened around the phone. He thought he could lure me into a trap, but I was ready. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I grabbed my gun, the same one I had been keeping hidden in the safe, and tucked it into the waistband of my pants. My mind was clear, focused. I wasn't going to let Richard get the upper hand. Not after everything he had done. I was going to finish this once and for all. The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, a desolate, abandoned place that had once been used for shipping but had long since fallen into disrepair. The perfect spot for a confrontation. I parked a few blocks away and made my way to the back entrance, slipping in quietly. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of mildew. The dim light from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long shadows across the room. I could hear him before I saw him, his voice low and tense, talking to someone. I crept closer, keeping to the shadows until I could make out two figures. Richard and his bodyguard, a hulking man dressed in black, stood near the center of the room. They hadn't seen me yet. "This ends tonight," Richard was saying, his voice filled with anger. "I'm not going to let him destroy everything." The bodyguard nodded, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. I knew I didn't have much time. I stepped out of the shadows, my gun drawn. "Looking for me?" I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. They both turned, surprise flashing across Richard's face before it twisted into fury. "You," he spat, his eyes narrowing. "You think you've won? You've ruined my life." I kept my gun trained on them, my hand steady. "You did that yourself, Richard." His bodyguard stepped forward, reaching for his gun, but I was faster. In one quick motion, I raised my own gun and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the empty space. The bodyguard crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering out of his reach. Richard's face went pale as he stared at his fallen man, then back at me. "You're insane," he muttered, taking a step back. "Maybe," I said, my voice cold, "but I'm not the one who started this." He lunged at me then, his face contorted with rage, but I was ready. I fired again, the bullet grazing his arm. He stumbled, clutching his wound, but didn't stop. We collided, falling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. I fought to get the upper hand, but he was stronger than I expected. His hands closed around my throat, squeezing, cutting off my air. I gasped, clawing at his hands, but his grip was iron. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then my hand found the gun. I twisted it in my grip, pressing the barrel to his side, and pulled the trigger. The sound was muffled by his body, but the impact was immediate. He froze, his grip loosening as the life drained from him. His hands fell away, and I pushed him off me, gasping for breath. I staggered to my feet, my chest heaving, my mind racing. Richard lay motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. He was dead. It was over. But as I stood there, staring down at his lifeless body, I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, just a hollow emptiness that had been there all along. I had won. But at what cost? The silence in the warehouse was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. Richard's body lay crumpled on the cold concrete, the pool of blood slowly spreading out beneath him. I stared down at him, my mind numb. I had wanted this moment for so long. But now that it was here, the weight of what I had done hit me like a freight train. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For a long moment I just stood there, frozen. The gun felt heavy in my hand, and my heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The bodyguard was slumped against the far wall, groaning in pain but alive. He wasn't my concern. It was Richard. I had killed him. And now what? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think, to move. I couldn't stay here. I had to clean up the mess, cover my tracks. My mind raced through the steps I needed to take. No one could know what happened here. I bent down and grabbed Richard's phone from his pocket, slipping it into mine. Then, I collected the gun, careful to wipe it clean of prints before tossing it into the drainage grate at the far end of the warehouse. I would have to find a way to deal with Richard's body later, but right now I needed to get out of here before someone found us. I walked quickly out of the warehouse, my shoes echoing against the concrete. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying the scene over and over again. Richard was dead. I had killed him, and there was no going back now. I drove in silence, the dark streets of the city flashing by like a blur. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by the gravity of what I had done. As I pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, I felt a wave of exhaustion crash over me. I was so tired, my body heavy with the weight of it all. But I couldn't rest yet. I still had work to do. Inside the house, the quiet was oppressive. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching on into infinity. I poured myself a drink, but it didn't ease the tension coiled tight in my chest. I needed to keep moving, needed to figure out what came next. I couldn't let my guard down now, not when everything was on the line. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions, covering my tracks, making sure that no one would ever be able to tie me to what happened in that warehouse. I wiped Richard's phone, erased the messages, the evidence of our confrontation. I paid a visit to the bodyguard's hospital room, slipping enough money into his hand to ensure his silence. He didn't ask questions, just nodded, his face pale and strained with pain. It wasn't enough. No matter how careful I was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, something that would eventually lead back to me. I was trapped in a web of my own making, caught in a spiral that I couldn't escape. Every time the phone rang, every knock at the door sent a jolt of panic through me. How long could I keep this up? How long before it all came crashing down? Then, one night, the call came. I was sitting in the living room, the TV on but muted, the flicker of images casting long shadows on the walls. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a moment I hesitated. My hand hovered over it, fear gnawing at my insides, but I knew I had to answer. Hello, my voice was tight, barely above a whisper. The voice on the other end was low, menacing. You think you've won, James, but you haven't. It's not over. A chill ran down my spine. Who is this? There was a pause, a cold silence that hung heavy in the air. Then, the voice spoke again. Softer this time, almost mocking. I know what you did, and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too. My hand trembled as I gripped the phone. What do you want? Another pause, and then a slow, deliberate laugh. You'll see soon enough. The line went dead, and I was left sitting in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was that? How did they know? Was it Richard's associate, the bodyguard, or someone else entirely? I stood up, pacing the room, my mind racing. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the weight of my paranoia. I had thought I was in control, but now I realized just how precarious my situation was. Whoever had called me wasn't bluffing. They knew something, and they were coming for me. The next few days were a nightmare. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. I kept seeing shadows, hearing footsteps that weren't there. The phone calls didn't stop, each one more threatening than the last. Whoever it was, they were relentless, and I had no idea how to stop them. One evening, after yet another call, I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gun from the drawer, checked to make sure it was loaded, and drove to the warehouse. If they were going to come for me, I was going to be ready. I wasn't going to let them take me down without a fight. The warehouse was dark, just as it had been the night I killed Richard. I parked my car out of sight and slipped inside, my gun drawn. The silence was suffocating, but I forced myself to stay calm. I moved through the shadows, my senses on high alert, every muscle tense. And then I saw him. He was standing near the back of the warehouse, his face hidden in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat as I raised the gun, my finger hovering over the trigger. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. He stepped forward, the dim light from the single bulb illuminating his face. My blood ran cold. It was the bodyguard. He smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "And you didn't think I'd let you get away with it, did you?" I tightened my grip on the gun. "What do you want?" His smile widened. "Justice, revenge. Call it what you want." Before I could react, he lunged at me. The gun went off, the sound echoing through the warehouse, but he was too fast. He tackled me to the ground, knocking the gun from my hand. We struggled, rolling across the cold concrete, each of us fighting for control. My mind raced, adrenaline surging through my veins. I couldn't let him win. Not now, not after everything. I had to survive this. I had to make sure he didn't walk away. With a surge of strength, I managed to push him off me, scrambling to my feet, when the gun was just out of reach, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. He stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes filled with rage. "This ends tonight," he growled, advancing toward me. I clenched my fists, ready for the fight of my life. "You're right," I said, my voice cold. "It does." The bodyguard's heavy footsteps echoed through the empty warehouse as he advanced toward me, his eyes burning with rage and a twisted sense of satisfaction. He thought he had me cornered, out of options. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm, calculating every move. The gun was just a few feet away, but there was no way I'd be able to grab it in time without him taking me down. "You really thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought no one would come after you. But I'm here, James, and I'm going to make sure you pay." I took a step back, putting some distance between us, my mind racing through possible ways to turn the situation to my advantage. "You think killing me will solve anything? It'll only drag you deeper into this mess." He laughed, a cold, joyless sound. "I'm not interested in solving anything, and I want you to suffer the way you made Richard suffer." The mention of Richard sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my system. I had made my choice that night, a choice that had led me down a dark, irreversible path. But now, standing on the brink of another life and death moment, I realized just how deep in I was. There was no turning back, not anymore. I took another step back, my eyes darting toward the gun again. He saw it too, his lip curled in a sneer. "If you're not getting to that gun," he said, as if reading my mind, "you're going to die right here, right now, just like Richard." As he lunged toward me, I reacted on pure instinct. I ducked under his arm, feeling the rush of air as his fist swung past me. I hit him hard in the ribs, and he let out a grunt of pain. But he was quick, faster than I expected for a man of his size. He recovered almost immediately, spinning around and landing a punch to my side. Pain exploded in my ribs, and I stumbled, but I couldn't afford to go down. I had to end this, now. The gun was still on the ground, just a few feet away. I feinted to the left, and when he fell for it, I dove for the gun, my hand closing around the cold metal just as he grabbed the back of my shirt and yanked me backward. I hit the ground hard, the gun slipping from my grasp again, skidding across the concrete floor. He was on me in an instant, his hands wrapping around my throat, squeezing with a terrifying strength. I gasped for air, my vision starting to blur as the pressure increased. Desperation fueled me. I clawed at his hands, but his grip was iron, unyielding. Black spots danced at the edge of my vision. I couldn't breathe. This was it. In one last surge of adrenaline, I swung my knee up, catching him square in the gut. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to suck in a breath of air. I twisted to the side, breaking free from his grasp, and scrambled for the gun. And my hand closed around it, and without thinking, I turned and fired. The shot echoed through the warehouse, deafening in the confined space. He froze, his eyes wide with shock as he looked down at the blood spreading across his chest. For a moment he just stood there, swaying slightly as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Then, he crumpled to the ground, a heavy thud reverberating through the empty warehouse. I lay there on the cold concrete, gasping for breath, the gun still clutched in my hand. My body ached, bruises already forming where he had hit me, but I didn't care. I was alive. I had survived. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up to a sitting position and looked at the bodyguard's lifeless form. The rage and hatred that had filled his eyes only moments ago were gone, replaced by a vacant stare. The blood continued to pool beneath him, seeping into the cracks in the concrete floor. I had killed again. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment I couldn't move, I couldn't think. My mind reeled with the enormity of what I had just done. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky and weak. The gun felt heavy in my hand, the weight of it pulling me down. I looked around the warehouse, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I needed to get out of here, now. But this time there was no going back. I had crossed every line imaginable. First Richard, now his bodyguard. The man who had come to make me pay had fallen, and now the full weight of my choices was crashing down on me. I stumbled out of the warehouse, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? Call the police? Run? There was no good answer, no way to make this right. I had destroyed everything. As I drove home, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head. The gunshots, the bodyguard's lifeless eyes, the cold concrete floor soaked with blood. This was my life now, a never-ending cycle of violence, betrayal, and death. When I pulled into the driveway of my house, the weight of everything I had done finally came crashing down on me. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep running, keep killing. But there was no way out. The darkness I had embraced had consumed me completely, and there was no escape. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house. Inside, the silence was waiting for me. The same silence that had haunted me since the night I discovered my wife's betrayal. But this time, the silence wasn't just a void. It was filled with the echoes of the lives I had destroyed, the choices I had made that had led me to this moment. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. I didn't know what was going to happen next. All I knew was that the reckoning wasn't over. Not yet. As I walked toward the house, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to look at it to know what it said. The darkness wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. I stood in the driveway, the night air heavy with the weight of my decisions. My hand hovered over my phone, but I hesitated before checking the message. I already knew. Richard's death wasn't the end, and the bodyguard's lifeless form was just another link in a chain I couldn't break. Finally, I pulled the phone from my pocket and glanced at the screen. The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. You think it's over. It's not. We're coming. My heart skipped a beat, the chill of fear settling in. Whoever was behind this wasn't done with me. I had poked the hornet's nest, and now the swarm was coming. Richard may have been the one pulling the strings, but there were more of them, and they weren't going to let me get away with what I had done. I needed a plan, and fast. The house loomed before me, dark and silent. I hadn't set foot inside since the night my life shattered. But now I had no choice. I pushed open the front door and stepped into the quiet, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. I headed straight for the basement. It was the only place I knew no one could find me, at least for a little while. My hand shook as I flipped the light switch, the old bulb flickering weakly before casting a dim glow over the concrete walls. The space was cold and unwelcoming, a reflection of the life I now found myself trapped in. Sitting in the corner, hidden beneath a pile of old boxes, was the safe. I dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I spun the dial. I had always been careful, always had a backup plan for when things went wrong, but even this felt inadequate now. The safe clicked open, revealing a small handgun, a few bundles of cash, and a passport with a fake identity I had never imagined I'd need to use. I stared at it for a long moment, wondering if this was my only option. Could I really disappear, leave everything behind? I pocketed the gun and the cash, but left the passport where it was. Running wouldn't fix this. They'd find me wherever I went. No, I couldn't run. I had to confront whoever was still coming after me. But first I needed information. I grabbed my laptop and began scouring everything I could find on Richard's associates. I had gathered plenty of dirt on him before, but I hadn't dug deep enough into the people connected to him. Whoever had sent that message wasn't just another thug. They knew too much. They had resources. Hours passed as I sifted through records, financial statements, and social media profiles. Slowly, a picture began to form. Richard had ties to more than just shady business dealings. He had been involved in something far deeper, a network of powerful men who didn't just dabble in corporate espionage but also in illegal trades, drugs, and arms deals. This wasn't just about his affair with my wife anymore. I had stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous. And now they were coming for me. I found a one that came up repeatedly in connection with Richard's dealings. William Novak. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a fixer, the kind of man you hired to make problems disappear permanently. And judging by the phone records and transactions I found, he was the one pulling the strings now. I didn't have much time. If they were coming for me, it wouldn't be long before they found me here. I needed to confront Novak before he sent anyone else after me. I needed to finish this once and for all. As I gathered the rest of my supplies, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a location coordinates. They wanted to meet. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It could be a trap. It almost certainly was. But I didn't have a choice. I had to go. If I ran, they'd just keep hunting me, and sooner or later, they'd catch up. I loaded the gun and slipped it into my waistband. Then, with a final glance around the empty house, I stepped outside into the night. The coordinates led me to an abandoned industrial park on the outskirts of town. The place was a maze of old factories and warehouses, their windows shattered, the once busy loading docks long since abandoned. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, far enough away that it felt like I was completely alone. I parked the car in the shadows and approached the building the coordinates pointed to. It was an old warehouse, just like the one where I had killed Richard. The irony wasn't lost on me. It felt like a twisted déjà vu, except this time, I wasn't going to be the one caught off guard. I slipped inside, my hand on the gun, every sense heightened. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. I moved silently, keeping to the shadows, listening for any sign of movement. The warehouse was empty, save for a single light hanging from the ceiling in the center of the room. Beneath it stood a figure tall and broad, his back to me. I recognized him immediately. William Novak. He didn't turn as I approached, didn't even flinch. He was waiting for me, expecting me. "You came," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I didn't have a choice," I replied, stepping into the circle of light. My hand hovered over the gun, but I didn't draw it, not yet. Novak turned to face me, his expression unreadable. He was older than I expected, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "You've caused quite a mess, James," he said, his voice steady. "Richard's dead, his bodyguard too, and now you're on the run. Did you really think you could walk away from this?" "I didn't start this," I said, my voice cold. "Richard brought it on himself." Novak smiled faintly. "Richard was a fool, but he was useful. You, on the other hand, are a loose end." I tensed, my hand tightening around the grip of the gun. "So what now? You send more of your men after me." Novak shook his head. "No, this ends here. You're going to walk away, James, you're going to disappear, and we'll forget all of this ever happened. And if I don't, The smile faded from Novak's face. "Then you'll die, right here, right now." The threat hung in the air between us, heavy and inevitable. I could feel the tension building, the moment stretching out as we stood there, each waiting for the other to make a move. But I wasn't going to let him control this, not anymore. In one swift motion, I drew the gun and aimed it at Novak's chest. His eyes flickered with surprise, but he didn't move. "Drop it," I said, my voice low, steady. "It's over." Novak stared at me for a long moment, then slowly raised his hands. But there was something in his eyes, a glint of something dangerous, something I hadn't anticipated. "Is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could react, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I spun around, but it was too late. 2 men stepped out of the shadows, their guns trained on me. Novak's voice was calm, almost amused. "You should have taken the deal, James." The room seemed to close in around me as I realized my mistake. I had walked right into his trap. And now, there was no way out. The cold barrel of a gun pressed into the back of my head, and I knew I was out of options. My heart pounded, the rush of adrenaline turning my thoughts into a blur. I had been so focused on Novak that I hadn't anticipated his backup. How could I have been so stupid? Novak stepped forward, his smile now full of cold satisfaction. "It's funny, isn't it? You thought you could control the situation, but the truth is you never had any control." The men behind me were silent, but I could feel the weight of their presence, professionals hired to do this sort of thing without a second thought. Novak wasn't just playing with me. This was the endgame. "You think killing me will solve your problems," I said, forcing the words out even though my voice betrayed my fear. "You think this will clean up the mess Richard left behind?" Novak chuckled softly, shaking his head. "This isn't about cleaning up a mess, James, this is about setting an example. You killed a man who was connected to very powerful people. People who need to know that when someone crosses us, there are consequences." "Richard crossed me first," I spat, my voice rising. "He destroyed my life, my marriage, everything. I was just fighting back." Novak's smile faded, his expression growing hard. "And look where that's gotten you." He gave a slight nod to the man standing behind me, and I braced myself, fully expecting the trigger to be pulled. But instead of a gunshot, I heard the familiar clatter of a phone ringing. Novak's eyes flickered with irritation as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the screen, and for a brief moment, something changed in his demeanor, something subtle, but enough to make him hesitate. He answered the call, his voice tight. "What is it?" I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but Novak's face grew darker with each passing second. He lowered the phone, his eyes narrowing as he looked back at me, assessing, recalculating. "It looks like your timing couldn't have been worse," Novak said slowly, tucking the phone back into his pocket. "You've got more friends than I realized." I frowned, confused. Friends? What was he talking about? No one knew where I was, not even my lawyer. I had been careful, staying off the radar. Novak stepped closer, his voice lowering. "There's a federal investigation into Richard's operations. When they're coming after everyone connected to him, including you, James." My heart skipped a beat. The feds. I hadn't expected that. If Richard's illegal dealings were about to be exposed, then Novak wasn't just trying to eliminate me, he was cleaning up loose ends to protect himself. He glanced over his shoulder at his men. "We'll deal with him later. Let's get out of here before this turns into something bigger." For a split second, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Novak was walking away. After all this, after the threats, the setup, he was just going to leave. The man behind me stepped back, his gun still trained on me but no longer pressing against my skull. Novak's men moved toward the exit, their footsteps heavy in the empty warehouse. I stood frozen, unsure if I should follow or make a move. Novak turned once more before leaving, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky, James, but don't think this is over. The feds won't protect you forever." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, and I was left alone, the echo of his words ringing in my ears. For a long moment, I didn't move. My hands were shaking, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The gun in my hand felt heavy, useless. I had been so close to ending this, and now it had slipped through my fingers. But the relief that washed over me was undeniable. I was still alive. I slid the gun back into my waistband and forced myself to take a deep breath. Novak might have walked away tonight, but I wasn't foolish enough to think this was truly over. He had resources, and now he knew that I was more than just a loose end. He was right about one thing: I couldn't count on the feds to protect me. I needed to get ahead of this, figure out what the feds knew about Richard's operation, and what my place was in their investigation. If I could use that to my advantage, maybe, just maybe, I could escape this nightmare for good. But first I had to survive the night. I drove back to the house, my mind racing with possibilities. Every time I thought I was close to the end, something new reared its head. Richard was dead, but his connections, his crimes, were far more widespread than I had anticipated. The house felt colder than usual as I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The darkness settled in around me like a suffocating blanket. I poured myself a drink, hoping to calm my nerves, but it did little to steady the storm in my mind. The feds were coming for everyone involved in Richard's operation, and I had been knee-deep in his world without even realizing it. If they linked me to any of it, I was done for. I sat at the table, staring at my phone, wondering if I should make the first move. Should I contact someone, an agent, a lawyer, before it was too late? But what would I say? That I had been dragged into something I barely understood? That I had killed Richard in self-defense, but everything else was a blur? No one would believe me. Hey. The phone buzzed in my hand, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was another message, but this one wasn't from Novak. It was from my lawyer. We need to talk. Urgently. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. I dialed the number, my breath shaky as I waited for him to pick up. James, my lawyer said, his voice tight with urgency. The feds are closing in. I just got word they're looking into you. You need to get out of town, now. What? How do they know about me? I asked, my voice rising with panic. They're connecting the dots. Richard's associates are already being questioned, and your name came up. If they dig deeper, they'll find everything. I felt my stomach drop. This was at the moment everything fell apart. Where do I go? I asked, my mind spinning with possibilities. Leave the country if you can. I'll do what I can from here, but it's only a matter of time before they come knocking. Get out while you still can. I hung up, the weight of his words sinking in. I had thought I could escape Novak, that I could outsmart him and his men, but now the law itself was coming after me, and there was no escaping that. I had no choice. I had to run. I grabbed my coat and threw a few essentials into a duffel bag, my hand shaking as I zipped it shut. My mind raced with the implications of what my lawyer had said. The feds, Novak, everything was closing in. If I stayed, I was a dead man. If I ran, it was only a matter of time before they caught up to me. But right now, I had to move. I left the house, locking the door behind me as if that simple act could somehow protect me from everything that was unraveling. The car engine roared to life and I sped down the empty streets, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear, regret, and desperation. Where could I go? Leaving the country seemed impossible, not with every move being watched, but staying here meant certain death. Novak wouldn't let me slip away again, and now the authorities had me in their crosshairs. I decided to drive toward the outskirts of the city, heading for the only place where I thought I could get some answers, the warehouse where everything had started. Maybe there was something I had missed, something that could give me an edge, a way out. At the very least, I needed to confront what had happened to make sense of this disaster. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette a dark reminder of the night I had taken Richard's life. I parked a few blocks away, walking the rest of the distance in the cold, biting wind. My breath was visible in the air, each exhale a reminder that I was still alive for now. I stepped inside, the stale scent of dust and decay filling my nostrils. The memories of that night rushed back, the struggle, the gunshot, the way Richard's body had gone limp in my arms. But now, the space felt even more suffocating, as if the walls themselves knew I was running out of time. I searched the area looking for anything, any clue that could help me, but it was no use. There was nothing here except my own guilt, my own mistakes. Then, from the shadows, a voice pierced the silence. Looking for something. I froze, my heart pounding as I turned to see Novak standing there, a gun in his hand, pointed directly at me. His face was calm, controlled, like a predator who had cornered its prey. How did you find me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Novak smiled coldly. You've been sloppy, James. You should have known you couldn't outrun this forever. I told you, this isn't over. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but Novak had me. There was no escaping this. You killed Richard, Novak continued, stepping closer. You thought that would be the end of it, but you don't understand how deep this goes. You've become a liability, and liabilities need to be dealt with. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Novak wasn't just here to tie up loose ends, he was here to finish what had been started. I didn't have a choice, I said, my voice shaking. He came after me. I did what I had to do. Novak's expression didn't change. We all make choices, James, and now, you'll have to live or die with yours. He raised the gun, the cold metal glinting in the dim light. My mind flashed through every moment that had led me here, the betrayal, the lies, the revenge, and now it was all coming to an end. But just as Novak pulled the trigger, a deafening gunshot echoed through the warehouse, but it wasn't his. Novak staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he clutched his chest. Blood poured from the wound, and he collapsed to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand. I turned, my heart racing, to see a figure standing in the shadows holding a smoking gun. It took me a moment to recognize him, an FBI agent, his badge glinting as he stepped forward. You're lucky we've been following Novak's operation for months, the agent said, holstering his weapon. We've got enough evidence now to bring them all down. I stood there, my mind reeling, unable to process what had just happened. The feds had been watching the whole time, Novak, Richard, all of it. They had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and now that moment had come. You're coming with us, James, the agent continued, his voice firm. But maybe, just maybe, we can work something out. In the days that followed, the weight of everything settled in. The FBI had enough evidence to take down Novak's entire operation, and with my cooperation, they offered me a deal, a chance to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. It wasn't much, but it was better than spending the rest of my life behind bars. I thought about everything that had happened, about my wife, about Richard, about the darkness that had consumed me. I had destroyed so much, lost so much, and now there was nothing left but the consequences of my actions. I sat in the cold, sterile room waiting for my lawyer to finalize the deal. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear: I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the door opened and the agent walked in, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever came next. This was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of another. I had survived, but at what cost? The darkness might have faded, but its shadow would follow me forever.